All right, everybody, welcome back to the warm down pool. Dan, the man Flack, Eric Skelly, back with you for another round. Lots to go on right now in the swimming world. We got the Sacramento Pro Series going there. Huge swims all around. We're seeing some familiar faces. Ryan Murphy making a guest appearance back into the world of swimming. But today, our guest, University of Idaho head coach, Dr. Mark Sowa. Coach, thank you for popping in the warm down pool with us.
Dude, who doesn't like a good warm down? Let me tell you.
Exactly.
Hold on.
We're excited to talk to you today. I think it's been a while since we've done an interview. Dan and I have been mostly just talking swimming to ourselves, which we do on a near daily basis. So now it's time to get our brethren into the fold and start talking some more about the changes and the evolutions of the sport. I think that's the biggest thing that we've really kind of leaned into as coaches on this show. And I know there's some other guests that we're hoping to get on, but Dan was big on this and I am too. So Coach, take it
Awesome.
away.
Well, great. Guys, thanks for having me. This is a really cool format. I'm trying to embrace this whole podcasting thing. I'm kind of a Luddite when it comes to technology. I don't have social media. I don't do any of that. But I'm convinced now that people are getting a lot more of their information and a lot more of their knowledge through these podcasts. And I think they can be a great tool. So I'm happy to be here, happy to discuss kind of my intellectual journey with this sport and kind of the things over the last quarter of a century we were just talking before the show, putting things in perspective in terms of what we want out of the sport and why we still do what we do. So anyway, fire away. Ask me some questions. Get me started there, Coach Black. Good to see you, buddy.
Yep. I know you and Dan have been working together. Dan and I have talked about that a little bit, and I'm excited to hear you guys expand a little bit more because it's funny. I tell people all the time when I was 22, 23, 24, and I was full of piss and vinegar. I knew everything. Man, I'm in my 50s now, and I'm trying to soak up everything like a sponge. So hopefully some of the younger coaches, if they're listening to this, can take some of this information, they can carry it on, and they can not make the same mistakes we all made when we were young idiot coaches. Although I think I still have the idiot part down pat, not the young part, but the idiot part.
Well, I'm pretty excited for this because I can safely say that the good doctor, Dr. Mark Sowa, the leader of the Idaho Vandals, is without question one of my favorite people in the whole wide world. And I have a great long-time relationship with Coach Mark. We are incredible friends in life. We both happen to coach. I do vividly remember when he started throwing out the idea, hey, man, I might be going to coach. I'm like, don't try it. You'll get addicted. Don't try it. And sure enough, he did. And I was like, I tried to tell you.
You're screaming that 50 meters away from me while I was running dry land during a swim camp. So it wasn't exactly the easiest conversation to have, but I do appreciate that memory. Yeah, Coach Dan and I go back a long ways.
But Mark is a tremendous coach. I've had the fortunate opportunity to go out and do some consulting with him and catch what he is doing and the very unique thing that he is doing with his team firsthand in action from year to year. And I've seen the impact that it has had on his student athletes, and it is an incredibly positive one. And one I think that there's a lot to be gained from listening to what Mark has to say. We talk all the time, and I'm like the sets guy, and he's the bigger picture guy. And it really works out great when we're not talking about, music and sports and all that other fun stuff and
parenting,
Yeah, you got it. So Dr. Sowa, I love saying that.
Cracks me up, man.
Yes, it does. Tell us about your swimming history. How'd you get into this whole wacky thing, this whole wacky world of competitive swimming?
That's how much time do we have for this? But
we got time for you.
No, man, swimming is such a unique sport. And I'm a Navy brat. I was born in Norfolk, Virginia. And there you go, right on. And
Dad was stationed in Japan, and I lived there for a couple of years. So yeah, I know the realm.
Yeah, and very quickly my dad got orders to the War College up in Newport, Rhode Island. And so we moved up there when I was 2. And I literally don't remember a time where I wasn't in the water. My parents put a pool in. I have no idea how they afforded that because we We couldn't afford much, but we could afford a pool. My mother taught swimming lessons to basically half of my town of North Kingstown, Rhode Island, in our backyard pool from 8 in the morning till 1 o'clock in the afternoon, 2 months out of the summer. It's not warm at the beginning of June sometimes in Rhode Island. And she made it work. And that was the soundtrack of my summer, just splashing and kids and water. But also these glasses that I have on, I've been wearing glasses since I was 2. And I think the reason why I fell in love with the water is because when I was underwater, I could see. The water acted to refract light, and I didn't have to wear these stupid glasses. And it opened up an entirely new universe to me. And I just wanted to be in that. And so by the time I was 5, I was begging my mom to join a competitive swim team. She made me wait until I was 6. The South County Sea Lions in South County, Rhode Island, under the stewardship of Pam Westcott, whose husband coached the University of Rhode Island for about 45 years, Uncle Mick. So there's a lineage there. Then I moved to Providence, Rhode Island, which is about a 30-minute drive from my home, to Little Rhodey Aquatic Club. But in 1991, the biggest change happened, and Little Rhodey Aquatic Club became the Bruin Swim Club, led by head coach Dan Flack, who is on this broadcast right now with us. And one of the first questions Dan asked me was, "What do you swim?" I said, "The 50 and the 100 freestyle." And he laughed and he said, "Yeah, not anymore, boy." And and, he convinced a 14-year-old that I was gonna be a miler. Judging by this unathletic body, I think he was like, "Hey, man, you just gotta outlast people." And so I fell in love with it. I fell in love with distance swimming. I fell in love with the challenge of it. I fell in love with just trying to outwork people. And then, I accepted an offer from the American University to swim there. Go Eagles, Claude the Eagle. They were in the Bizarro ACC at the time, the Colonial Athletic Association, the CAA. But I never wanted to be a coach. That wasn't what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a professor. Specifically, I wanted to be a professor of history. That's why I ended up at AU. I worked at the Smithsonian. I loved public history. I loved all that stuff. And, you know, when I graduated from AU in 98, I went immediately to graduate school to start working on my doctorate in history. And while I was there, I was broke. I needed to make ends meet. So I took a job coaching with the Ocean State Squid with Josh Stern. He had a young teenager swimming there at the time, Eric Vent, who went on to do pretty good things, among others. And again, I started off as the assistant cuttlefish coach, coaching 6-year-olds, and then one of the head age group coaches strangely got mono, so they were like, "Hey, Sowa, can you fill in?" And so I started doing that, and then come springtime, I decided to leave graduate school with just my master's. I was 22. I didn't know what the hell I was going to do. Matt Credich, who was the head coach of Brown at the time, offered me the assistant men's and women's position, making $18,600 a year, which I thought was a fortune. And
Because
I
it
said,
won.
"What?" It
Yeah.
really was, man.
I
So,
about that time, I was making 21 grand with the Decatur Swim Club in Decatur, Illinois, and I thought I was rich. I was
yeah.
top of the world.
Well, I tell you, and I was in the right place at the right time for someone who didn't want to coach. A lot of you guys know Matt's work, and he's arguably one of the most respected coaches in our profession right now. And to be a
Absolutely.
young coach, to be around him was pretty amazing. And I remember after my first year, Matt sat me down and he said, you were great this year. You were great, but we got a problem. I said, "What's the problem, man?" He's like, "Every time you talk about the team, you refer to it in the third person. Stuff like your breaststrokers, your sprinters." He's like, "You got to start changing the way you say these things and take ownership of this. This is our team right now." And from that moment, I went all in, and that's when I knew I was going to coach, because the things I was looking for out of teaching, I was getting out of coaching and more. I was able to connect with people on an intellectual basis, on a spiritual basis, on a psychological basis, on an emotional basis, athletic basis, on a physical basis for years at a time, as opposed to a 3-month semester where maybe 3 out of 10 kids want to be in your classroom. So there it is. That's what leads me to kind of the beginning of the coaching stuff through the swimming journey there, Flack.
Yeah, it's wild that you became a coach to me
Yeah.
back in the day.
Me too. Me too.
But one thing that I could clearly see when you were a young guy. And one like I was old, I was like 23. I mean, and boy, that tell you want to talk about somebody who thought he knew everything. This guy right
Yeah, you
here,
did.
upon further review, I did not know everything, but I was very enthusiastic about what I thought I knew. And one of the things that I could really tell about you in your youth was you were real big on the story behind the story, right? And that's why you liked history so much. And you'd crack me up because every once in a while, some event would come up and you'd relate it to something earlier in U.S. history, and you'd tell me the story behind the story. And I'm a big story behind the story guy.
Well,
So
that's
when I
what
started,
connects us. Yeah.
sorry.
Yeah, I say those are the strings that connect us, which is it's not curtain open, curtain closes. I mean, these are the continuity behind it. So
Absolutely. And I knew you loved I knew all the stories about the swimming world and what was really going on behind the scenes. And you were always a very eager listener during those. But one of the things that in watching you coach, as opposed to I value it in our personal relationship as well. But the words and the phrases that you use, they're very intentional, and if you're paying attention, they really make a lot of sense. Let's talk a little bit about your educational history because, well, coaching wasn't always the plan, like you said,
right.
and you are now a doctor. So how'd that happen?
Yeah. Yeah, coaching wasn't the plan, but then coaching became my life and my classroom and kind of like what you were saying before when you were a young coach, you emulate coaches that you've had. You were Schulberg 2.0. When I was a young coach, I tried to be Flack and then I tried to be Stern, and it took me about 10 years to be myself, to be Sowa, to find my voice. So the biggest, you talked about intentionality with words. That was the biggest thing I think I learned from working with Matt for 5 years
Very
was
much so, yeah.
he never spoke out of turn. And so I'll give you an example now. One of the rules that we have on our team is we don't use profanity. Now, I'll drop an F-bomb with the best of them.
With the best of them.
But I try to explain the reasoning behind the rule to my team when we go over them. I say, why do I have this? And none of them really know the answer. I said, because if you can pause before you speak and think about the words that you're choosing, you're probably going to choose better words because words do have power. And as a coach, you really, I think, need to pay attention to that and understand that. Flash forward to 2016, our sport is tricky when it comes to not the day-to-day side of it, but the overall institutional side of it. And in 2016, I saw the handwriting on the wall that our team was in danger of being cut. I was engaged. I just bought a house. I had 3 potential stepkids. I knew I needed to try to stay in Moscow. And how am I going to stay in Moscow without a job? And so even though I had this master's degree in history, I'm like, well, I'm here. I get free classes. Maybe I'll work on another master's in education so that I could go teach. And so I went up to literally the ivory tower up here. It's 5 floors up on the top of Memorial Gym to the Center for Sports Ethics here at the University of Idaho. And I sat down with Dr. Sharon Stahl, who is kind of the foremost leader in moral reasoning and character development as it relates to sport. And I sat down with her and I explained my situation, and she's like, "Okay, yeah, let's work on your doctorate." And I tried that 25 years ago. Didn't work out very well. I
Yep.
said, "I'm a full-time coach. I own a club team. I'm about to get married. You're crazy." And she's like, "Just do it. Just give it a try." And no pun intended, I dipped my toe into the waters. I signed up for one class, moral reasoning and character development and education, and it blew my mind. Stimulated something in me that I haven't felt in a long time. It forced me to look at the why behind some of the things I do as a coach. If I was to pat myself on the back, and I tell this to recruits, I'm not a science guy. I'm not afraid of it, but I'm not an analytical guy. That's not my deal. I'm very intuitive on the pool deck. I feel things. I feel the pulse of my team. So I was making these decisions as a coach because it felt right. But when I started the doctoral work, it started to turn that reflection inward as to why do I do the things that I do. And then I started looking at the systemic side of the NCT, and I saw a problem. I saw a problem with how we were treating our athletes. Basically we were coaching commodities and not people. And that frightened me a little bit. And I started to think about past teams I had coached. Like I worked with Tim Murphy on the Harvard men's team years ago. And these poor kids, Tim's an intense dude. I love him. I love Murph to death.
Just a
Love.
little bit.
Yeah, that might
Just a
be the
little.
understatement of the year. And so the year I was there, I played a role. I was the most laid back, nicest dude. I was basically Murph's foil. Not that Murph is not a nice guy, but those guys needed it because they were so uptight and so anxious. And I really started to think about it, like, why is that? And if you think about just a normal NC2A athlete, all right, 20 hours devoted to their sport, you add in getting to practice, time in the training room, all that stuff, just round it up to 24 hours. That's an entire day out of your week, right? That's one day. So when those guys sit down in the classroom with the best and the brightest of the world, and they look to their left and they look to their right, they're already a day behind everybody else. And we all know what it feels like to be a day behind. Like when you look at your to-do list and you're like, Jesus, I got all this stuff to do. What happens? You start getting anxious. That's their baseline, what we call trait anxiety. That's your baseline trait anxiety right there. It's already tuned up. And so when you stress somebody in a certain way, when you throw something new at them, that level of trait anxiety is going to spike. And that's where people can make dramatic decisions. So that's what kind of got me into this doctoral research. I finished the degree in 22. Well, I defended in 22. I think I walked in 23. A lot of interesting stuff went down in the last couple years of that. One of them was 2020 with COVID, which is the year I did the actual research project. In 2022, we had a quadruple homicide on our campus when I did the second iteration of the research. So talk about anxiety. There was a lot of it there. And so the doctoral stuff made me a better coach. I do things differently now. I don't raise my voice ever. I pay attention. I actually don't talk as much on the pool deck as I used to because I'm trying to watch everybody. Back to this intuition side, I'm trying to feel out what's going on and making small adjustments with that. I'm coaching personalities and people, not just bodies moving through a medium. And so we'll talk about kind of the nuts and bolts of that as we move forward with this. But that answer your question there, Flack?
Yes. Very
Perfect.
good.
All
Very
right.
much
Cool.
so.
All right.
Coach, I really, one of the things that you said right there, I think is incredibly important, especially given the situations that we're dealing with at the Division I level. And you're obviously on the front lines of that. You said you're coaching you're coaching people, personalities, individuals. You're not coaching commodities. And when
Correct.
you see roster limitations, and I'm sure you've had to deal with it just as much as the next person
Right.
because having to make those hard ones,
Yeah.
that's a double-edged sword, because if you're coaching commodities, when you have to cut those individuals, that it's hard, but it's easy. I hate to say that, but when you coach those personalities and you get to know those individuals and you have to make those hard decisions, it can weigh heavy on our souls as coaches. And I think that's a very difficult balance for people to manage. I had to deal with it a little bit even at my NAIA school back before I took Lake Forest. But I think you're on the right path. I really do, because
Well,
if you're looking at if you're looking at athletes as cattle, then you're missing a huge segment of why we do this sport. It's not about the W's, it's not about the wins or the PRs. It's about those relationships and those connections. Would you agree with that?
absolutely. Last month, I had to tell 11 people that they no longer had a spot on this team. And it was awful. It
Perfect
was
timing for it to happen.
It was probably the worst week of my professional career. And I wasn't gray before it all happened right then. I
I
wish
believe
that
that.
was the truth. But, so I'll tell you a quick story and a quick aside. What really sparked my interest in this anxiety and coping skills thing was in 2017. I heard an interview with a woman by the name of Kate Fagan. I believe she was working for WESPN at the time, and
Yes.
she had just written a book called "What Made Maddie Run." And uh, I I bought the book and I sat down and I read the entire thing from start to finish. and it scared the living bejesus out of me because it was written about a beautiful young woman by the name of Madison Holleran who was at the University of Pennsylvania as a freshman and jumped off a 9-story garage in January of her freshman year. And she had everything going for her, and her coaches did everything right, and her parents did everything right. And she still took her own life. And that's what sparked this thing because I started looking at the women I coached, and every year I could see these wonderful, bright, intellectual, strong, confident, athletic women tying themselves up in knots and beating themselves up. One of the things I would always say to them is like, all right, would you ever talk to one of your teammates like you talk to yourself? And I would like call out one of their best friends. I'm like, would you say this stuff to Lauren after a race? And they're like, no, of course not. I said, well, then why are you such a good teammate to her and you can't be a good teammate to yourself? Imagine if me as a coach said those things to you that you're saying to yourself. I'd be fired. I mean, that's abuse, but we accept that self-talk because somehow there is that culture in this sport because it's such an outcome driven sport. And these are such type A personalities that that's the way that they were raised. No fault of the coaches, no fault of the parents. That's just the climate and the culture of this sport, and it's endemic. And so I thought to myself, there has to be another way of doing this. How do we take that burden off of them? I always say, if you're going to swim with the weight of the world on your shoulders, you're going to sink to the bottom of the pool, So how do we unburden them? How do we get them back to a point where it was just them racing their friend across the pool to see who could get to the other side faster? Like, how do we get there again? Because all of them at some point loved this sport. And at some point, the sport that they love is seemingly turning against them. And that is tragic. And if we don't pay attention to it, we're going to have blood on our hands if we haven't already. And so that was kind of the Archimedes aha eureka moment right there where I'm like, all right, let's develop a coaching methodology, what we call an educational intervention to try to help these kids and to try to help alleviate some of this anxiety and potentially increase their ability to cope in a sporting setting. And so that's kind of the root of where the research came from.
I
That's so
think
interesting that you bring up that story because I can vividly remember the very first time I've been out to Moscow and the University of Idaho to work with you many times. But the very first time I went out there, it was the very first practice, and you happened to bring uh, hey, would you talk to yourself
Yeah.
or your teammate the way you talk to yourself? That thing, you could now, it's a very unique Coach Sowa's the team he's got to coach. It's a very unique situation. It's a large single sex team. It's a large women's team. And he has one graduate assistant and that's it. So he certainly has to be intentional. He certainly has to be paying attention
She's
to
full time now. We do have a
excellent,
full time one, but for
excellent.
about a 4 year period, yeah, for a 4 year period we didn't. And but yeah, Elizabeth thankfully is full time. But continue.
good.
So it was my very first day there, and you dropped that knowledge on them. And some of there's a chunk of your team that had heard this before, and it was not new to them. It was an important reminder, but it was not new to them. Then I looked around and saw the looks on the faces of the freshmen and the whoa, aha moment. And I'm thinking to myself, freshmen, freshmen,
Yep.
freshmen.
Yeah,
I
they're
could
not hard to spot.
well,
Yep.
but I
Yeah,
didn't know, right?
Yeah. Right.
I'd been
right,
there like
right.
3 hours, but that's what really struck me. I thought it was phenomenal that you were telling them that, and Lord, it makes such sense. But it's one of those things where I laughed, and I even told you, I patted you on the back afterwards, and I was like, "My man, you're a lot of things. You know what? You're not. You're not Charlie Brown's teacher with the want uh, to your athletes. They are listening to you, dude."
Yeah.
And you're like, "Really?" And I'm like, "Yes, they keep doing what you do." Yes, 100%. They are listening.
Well, that's first of all, that's very nice of you to say. But second of all, that talk about assistants. Like every time I have a meeting with the team, it's always so good to have an assistant or somebody else there because, I need to look at somebody and be like, all right, how'd that go? What was their body language? What, like, were they connecting? Were they off in space? Like, how'd that go? Like, tell me. And because then there needs to be follow-up to these things. You just don't throw it out there in the ether. You have to continue to drive thematic points over the course of, 144 days. Again, when we talk about the nuts and bolts of the research, that's what it is. So, Eric, you had a comment.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we talk about anxiety, and that we're going to go much deeper into that with the research and stuff. As a coach, and I had been doing it for about, I guess, 25 years at that point, because I'm working on year 30 right now. I had never really taken that into consideration until COVID. That was the very first time, and I think we all got a wake up call with that, because for me, with my athletes, I can't speak on you guys, but the one time they could come in the pool was the one day they could take a mask off. They could it felt normal. Like, and it was honestly, I'll say this, and I'll scream out my high. We may not have had our greatest year times wise, but that was probably the most relaxed team I've ever had, because they could be in the water, and that was the freedom that they didn't have in the outside world. And but on the flip side of that, I had a son that was going through those lockdowns in high school, and the amount of anxiety that built up in that kid, where he went off to college the very next year after 2020, and unfortunately he had to drop out. He's like, "Yeah, I can't do it. I need a break." And he took a year off, and he's now back in school. He's graduating next year, so he took that gap year. But I was on the front lines of both those sides of the spectrum, and that was the very first time that, and I was a yeller. I no question about it. I raised my voice, and my personality is big. I project a lot. I think the common phrase that is used to describe me is over the top. Just call me an asshole. We'll call it a day. I'm good. But what I've discovered is that, and I can't remember who told me this. I know Bill Dorincott, who was my head coach at Ashland before he went to Penn State and then ultimately Ohio State. Bill was a yeller, and he doesn't do that nearly as much, and he told me one time, he goes, if I want people to lean in, not lean back. So I'm like, I'm not raising my voice. I'm making them to hear me, because, like you mentioned, Charlie Brown's teacher, that's the big one. Like, wonk wonk, man. You yell, they're going to tune you out. Especially this generation.
Yeah,
It's a
and fear works as a
yeah,
motivator, but at what
only for
cost?
so long.
Yeah, and at what cost? I mean, there's lingering damage to that, but it does work. And the few I've had tough kids. I've had tough kids to coach. I had one this year who it was great, but continuing to try to figure out how to foster a healthy relationship with us because she wanted criticism. See, criticism is not coaching. It's
Mhm.
criticism. But that was what she was used to. And she's like, you're too positive all the time. And I'm like, well, understand what I'm saying first. Okay. If I say, all right, good job, even if it wasn't your best time, I'm acknowledging what you just did by putting yourself out there, putting yourself in that situation, looking to learn and to explore stuff. I'm not saying 5-10 is a great performance, but I am saying good job because that needs to be acknowledged right there. Okay, I'm not placating you. So understand the difference. So back to these teaching moments, you use them. But it's funny you mentioned COVID. We learned a lot from COVID. One of the things I think Dan would agree with this one too is that sometimes simple is better.
Yeah.
Yes.
You have to
My gosh,
simplify a
yes.
lot. You have to simplify a lot of things. You have to, I'll quote Murph again. Murph would yell at me sometimes, being like, Soa, don't have these guys do calculus before they add and subtract. Sometimes simple is good. The other thing we learned, back to the anxiety side, is that you can miss a week and it didn't ruin your season. Now, is it optimal for your season? No. But guess what? Like, the world kept on spinning. You still had a shot. Get back, figure it out. And it took a little less of the stress off of this has to be my lifetime best performance all the time. Back to I'll quote myself. You're not a 4,900 freestyler. That's not who you are. Okay. You went 49 seconds. That's a moment in time. That moment in time is now done. You don't carry your 49 up to the block and say, here it is. Look at here. That's a moment in time. Be proud of that moment in time, but that's a moment in time. The clock doesn't tell the whole story. I had an athlete go 413 in the 400 IM her sophomore year. She went 417 this year. Now, did she suddenly get 4 seconds worse? Absolutely not. Not even close. She still won the event. but no one knows besides her, myself, and her teammates and her parents, the story behind that 417 and what it took to even get to that performance right there. And so if we just solely judge it on it's 4 seconds slower than the year before, that's not right. And we shouldn't do that. So look deeper into these things. All right.
Yeah.
Cool.
I just even had to drop in dealing with a master swimmer that I coach who is type A as they get and wanted to go faster and wanted to go faster and had done a remarkable job training wise and did a very good performance at Masters Nationals, but it wasn't up to what he thought he was capable of doing. And, in a perfect world, I also believed he could have probably done better. But I had to remind him, hey, meticulously keep notes on every single thing that you eat, how you sleep, all of that. All that training didn't walk out the door when the race ended.
Right.
It's still with you.
Yep.
It might not have manifested itself to the highest degree when you wanted it to, but it is still there. And now you can continue to build on it.
That's perfect.
Once I kind of said that, usually light bulb go off. And he was like, "Okay, let's get back in and work." He's a very enthusiastic 66-year-old. I'll tell you
Well,
that.
that's the thing, like we all make that mistake, coaches and swimmers. We try to validate an entire season based on one performance, and that's bogus. Like you got better. Objectively, you got better. You've done things over the course of the last 6 months, day to day. You got better, and so again, always, you're never going to go as fast as you think you can go. You never will. And the exciting part about that is that means there's always another chance to go faster. Like that's
Mhm.
cool. Be proud of the moment, but know that it still wasn't as fast as you can go because if it was, you're done. Like just stop the sport. So once you kind of embrace that, it's actually liberating in a lot of ways.
It I think that's the hardest thing for coaches and athletes to really take hold of is and unfortunately, our sport is so time-based. It is results-based, so 100%, and you're right, we do tie ourselves to results, and I don't know about you guys, but I know I've had my end of the seasons, and I've talked to other coaches, and you could have 98% PRs at your championship. That 2% is what you're hung up on. You're tied to that 2%. Did I not rest him enough? Where did we screw up in the weight room? I mean, and you brought it up. Would you talk to a teammate the way you talk to yourself?
Oh, yeah.
Would you talk to your assistant coach the way you talk to yourself? And I love that phrase. I'm stealing it. That's coming out this year at Lake Forest College, and I will credit you, Dr. Sowa.
Well,
But
well,
I
oh, I'm sorry, to cut you off.
No, you're good. I think that having people understanding the process, and I've heard a couple interviews with Caleb Dressel. He did one with Graham. I can't remember his name, but he did a series where he really broke a lot of that down because he was just mentally and emotionally beating himself up because he wasn't breaking world records every time, and he had to really get over that hump before I think it was the 2021 Olympics. So again, that's another one of those where self-talk that can be just
Well, hey,
powerful
Flack
both
says
ways, positive and negatively.
Flack says it all the time. He's like, upon further review. And and and
Yes,
and that's
yes,
and
Big
he
that's
has.
review guy.
yeah, and that's part of this coaching methodology is the reflection side of it. It's the upon further review. It's taking a step back, digesting your subjective lived experience in this sport and understanding that it's nuanced and it's unique. And it's unique to you, which is why it's subjective and personal. I don't know what it's like for Dan to move through the water because I'm not Dan. I don't know what it's like for Eric to move through the water because I'm not Eric. But we
Ugly,
well,
ugly, very
but we
ugly.
but we but we've been involved in this sport in some capacity for 40 to 50 years, so we have certain knowledge about it, but no one knows what that experience is like except the individual, and that's so cool. I mean, we literally immerse ourselves in our sport. We dive into our sport. We have this beautiful relationship with the water. It's both passive and active at the same time. If you think about floating, right? Floating you have to surrender yourself to the water, right? You have to passively just trust that water will hold you. However, you have to actively manipulate your body in the medium in order to stay afloat. So it's an active and passive moment. Where does the water end? Where does the person begin? All that good stuff. Anyway, that's the philosopher in me right there. All right, other questions, guys.
Well, let's get to the meat and potatoes of the journaling, the studying, what you actually did in your dissertation, and what results that you saw, and maybe how it could possibly relate. Is it repeatable? Uh, Questions like that.
All right, I'm going to try to make a lot of stuff like 6 years of research and boil it down to about 6 minutes here and not get too heady on you. But really, it kind of stems from what I just talked about, this understanding that the subjective lived experience is sport. Why we love sport is it's the ultimate being in the moment. Think of things that we love the most in this world. Music, when you're really digging music, you are in that moment. Sport, again, if you're performing it in a flow state, right? You can be no other place than that moment, that here and now. When you're intimate with your partner, again, that moment right there. So that's what sport is. That's what draws us to sport. So I love that aspect of it. And so there's a philosophical school of thought called phenomenology, right? So phenomenology is the study of the subjective lived experience, which how the heck do you describe somebody's subjective lived experience? Because you're always looking at it from the outside looking in. Even the individual themselves, if they're trying to describe an experience, it's after the fact. It's not in the fact. So it's very elusive. But phenomenology has this methodology, and everybody says all these educational researchers say that they're doing a phenomenological study, but they're really not. Again, it's more anyway, I don't want to get tied into that. But what you're essentially trying to do with phenomenology is you're trying to take an experience and you're trying to bracket off the experience and reduce it down to its essence, the essence and the essential truth behind the experience in order to better understand what that experience is right there. Okay. That long story short is what you're trying to do. And so that is what this educational intervention, this coaching methodology is based on. All right. So how did we do it? What did we do it? Well, I just didn't want to do this heady philosophical thing. I wanted to be able to have some kind of analytical data that people could look at and say, aha, this works. All right. So what we did is we found two psychological instruments, the sports anxiety scale and the athletic coping skills inventory. Okay. The SAS2 that measures, again, trait anxiety in a sports setting. It's a valid and reliable instrument. Same thing with the athletic coping skills inventory. It looks at athletes' ability to cope within an athletic setting. Right. And these have been used in a lot of different psychological studies. So those were the two instruments that we used. In the initial study, we ran it in the fall of 2020. We were the first team at Idaho to actually run a competition. I mean, there was a lot of anxiety floating around, if you will. And so it was kind of perfect because the goal of this was to not only finish the dissertation, but to help people. Like I wanted to help, and maybe this was a way to do it. So that the treatment group was my team. Okay. And then we got two different other teams, one that's 8 miles down the road and then another one in New Mexico to be the control groups so what we did is we pre-tested them at the beginning of week number 1, and then we post-tested them at the end of week number 12. Why 12 weeks? Well, guess what? That brings you through the first invitational in a collegiate season. So it's perfect. If you run a 2-peak season, bam, right there. So it was nice. And it's almost an entire semester. So if you go back to educational theory, if you're going to force a change, you need to do it over time. It's not a quick fix kind of thing. So anyway, what was the methodology? I tried to come up with 12 different topics of reflection that would take them down, bracket down their experience down to its essence. What's interesting is I didn't even talk about competition until I believe week 9. That's how long we had to take to kind of get them to the point where they could even deal with competition. Right. So what did we do? On Monday, I would introduce the topic of reflection with kind of a ad-libbed mini lecture on how it impacted my life even. So introduce it on Monday. On Wednesday, it was their favorite day of the week. Wednesday was story time. So I'd pull them out with about 15 minutes left to practice, sit them down on the ground, and I would literally read to them because they're not going to read on their own. I'll get to that in a second. Literally read to them. Who doesn't like to get read to? I mean, there's
They
an
love
intimate,
story
yeah.
time.
Yeah, story time's the best.
They
Plus,
were
they're
hyped.
not in the water. They're not in the water. That's a good thing
Saw it with
too.
my own 2 eyes. They loved it.
Yeah.
Well,
So
there's no 400 IMs on repeat, so yeah, they'll take
no,
story time.
but the sometimes it was an academic text, sometimes it was more of a trade text, but it would relate back to the initial topic. On Friday, they would start practice in small groups of their peers, and they would just talk about the topic with their peers. So now they're seeing this unique subjective subject of theirs, but the universality side of it, that it relates to their peers too. And then on Saturday, at the end of practice, they would break out their laptops or eventually their phones, and they would hop on. At first, it was Blackboard, but eventually it became Canvas, and there would be a prompted journal response talking about the topic, and they would write. And then on Sunday, I would respond to them. So there's this connection right away with their coach saying that your words matter, therefore you matter. Therefore, this topic matters. And so we did this over the course of 12 weeks. Now, what are some examples of the topics? So week number 1, remember what it was like to learn how to swim, taking them all the way back to that first moment where maybe they went into the water for the first time, whatever. I just talked about it briefly with my mom teaching swimming lessons in the backyard. Week number 2 was becoming a swimmer. Okay. There's a difference between when you joined your first swim team and when you became a swimmer. There's a moment, all right, maybe it was a race, maybe it was a certain practice where the activity that you do became part of your identity and part of who you are. So there were topics like that. One of the craziest topics that we would get some of the deepest responses was the idea of control, just this concept of control. And all of them, again, back to this type A personalities, want to control everything. And, just this idea that sometimes you have to relinquish the need for control in order to gain it back. Flow is a topic. One of my favorite topics, to quote a great sports philosopher from Penn State University, Flack, Scott Kretschmar, it was the sweet tension of uncertainty was the name of the topic, the sweet tension of uncertainty. And that's what sport is. Like you don't race a heat sheet, right? Like you don't know what the outcome is going to be. And so that's why it's this sweet tension, it's sweet because that's what gets us going. But it also is the cause of our anxiety a lot, I use this metaphor of the daily dance versus the daily grind. That was another topic. And then there were 3 weeks in a row that were relationship weeks, a relationship to your team, relationship to your coach, and relationship to competition. Those were 3, bam, 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 3 weeks in a row. But I believe that was like week 7, 8, 9. And then finally, like week 12 was, I believe, Truth in Essence. It was really, they wrote as a group about 150 pages of journals. They wrote over 100,000 words as a group. The average response was about 500 words a response. And so when we post-tested them, we saw a statistically significant reduction in anxiety and approaching significance in coping skills. There was no movement at all in the 2 control groups, which was really interesting. What's cool is in 2022, they actually asked to do the study again. So I ran it again in 22 and we got even better results, which was pretty cool. And
That's
then in 24, I ran it a third time. And again, statistically significant results across the board. I didn't use control groups in the 22 and the 24 iteration because frankly, we knew what the control would be. And some of these kids, I used the same reflection topics because it took me about 3 months to come up with them to begin with. I toyed with changing them, but I didn't because there was a full year between it. So some of these kids did it a second time. And what's cool is when you read their journals, they'll tell the same story, but deeper because they're older, they're more mature, they've been in this program longer. They have a deeper understanding of what that moment meant to them. It brings tears to your eyes when you think about it. Couple of very important points of this. All of this has to happen within the 20-hour training week. Or if you're a club coach, say, all of it has to happen during practice time for it to work. In order for them to buy into it, first of all, you're giving up time in the water to do this. So you're saying that this is important. This is more important than actually the physical training side of it. That's powerful right there. And anecdotally, I can tell you there were a couple times where, either practice was really hard on the Saturday or we were traveling and we were at a meet. I'd be like, all right, you can leave, get your journals done. And I would have to continue to remind them to get it done because the moment they left the pool deck, it became one more thing in their life. And these are kids that were digging it. They loved it. They loved it. But the moment they left the pool deck, it's homework. And that can't be the case. Flack, you asked if it could be replicated. I had some colleagues on the cross country staff try to replicate it. But the problem that they ran into is they were the volunteer assistants. So they couldn't control practice. They couldn't do what I was doing. And so it became kind of, again, an afterthought. And they got some decent journal responses, but they couldn't have the consistency of the methodology to do it right, directed by the head coach or the position coach or whatever. It has to be within practice time for it to work. So that in a nutshell is what we did. Back to the roster cuts. This was brutal, having to eliminate a third of my roster, but move the clock back 2 months. I carried 42 women this year, 42. That's a lot. Before any of these cuts happened, you know how many people I had in the transfer portal? I had one. And that was a freshman who just wanted to be closer to home. 1 out of 42 is because this environment that we've created here is nurturing. It allows space for people to grow, to be who they are. And there's been the question always is do we perform well because of this? And I've never tried to correlate that because the idea is to move away from that would be the exact opposite of what I'm saying with this research. But there's plenty of sports psychological research that shows that, and you guys are smart enough to figure this out. If you reduce anxiety, you're probably going to perform better. Like these things, there's a direct correlation right there. So you want to have a little bit so that you can get into an arousal state. Like you don't want to eliminate all your anxiety, but you want to be able to understand and control it. I'll give you one more example, and then 2 years ago, not this past season, the season before, one of my best athletes, we're at our midseason invite, all right, and she decided she was going to double the 500 and the 2 IM, you know. I told her at the beginning of the year, I'm like, tell you what, you break 2 minutes in the 200 IM, we won't race the 500 anymore because she had raced the 500 as a freshman. Anyway, goes to the invite, races prelims of the 500 and goes about 4 seconds slower than her best time. And you could see her face just drop. And she hadn't raced the 500 all year. It wasn't a bad swim. She was just rusty. Okay. Gets up in the 2 IM, gets beat in the prelims, goes 206, which is terrible. I mean, just terrible. So I talked her off the ledge, kind of reminded her of just objectively why that was difficult. Let's scratch the 500, do the 200 IM, tonight. Little did I know, she went back to a hotel room and she just journaled. She used all of these skills that we had talked about. And she comes back that night and goes 200 and drops 6 seconds. And then,
Wow.
at the end of the year, won 158 and, was swimmer of the year. But that's a kid who used those skills to calm herself down and figure out how to let the snow globe, all that distraction settle down so that she could see the forest for the trees,
Absolutely.
I think that's something that a lot of athletes, you talk about reducing the anxiety, not eliminating it. I think that is something that impacts, especially when it's time to taper, rest, fine tune, whatever you're going to call it. If you start to reduce that anxiety, that you're going to be a little more anxious is the best way to describe it because you're getting excited. You're at a much more relaxed state. You can't wait to get into the water, and I think that man, that's going to have a massive impact on performance. So you talk about not being able to correlate it, not wanting to correlate it too much. But man, again, you said it like if you've got kids that are in a great mental state, and they're going to perform at 99 out of 100. There's always going to be that X factor that's going to hold
Yeah.
something back. But man, 99 out of 100, man, they're going to
Well,
perform.
look, long story, and I think Flack wanted to say something, but something popped into my head. Like, you don't fix this stuff. Okay. You said, you don't want to eliminate anxiety. You don't fix it. Okay. It's not like all of a sudden after we post test them, all right, you're fixed. We reduce your anxiety. That's not the way this stuff works. Like, the voice in your head is part of you. That'll always be there. The mistake people make when they have these negative thoughts, right, is they try to push it away, to eliminate it, right? You don't want to do that. Like, that's who you are. What you want to do is almost personify that voice and say to it, like, hey, why are you saying these things right now? Like, what is it that's really bothering you? And that's where this reflection stuff comes in. And then, the voice maybe won't be as loud. Maybe the voice will start saying other things,
Hmm.
and that's the important stuff. Your journey is not linear. Okay. It's not, you don't start this thing and it goes and then it ends. There starts and stops, there are twists and turns, it's two steps forward, one step back, but you're still moving forward at times. And that's the beauty of sport. Like, sport, swimming in particular, has inherent value. Okay. And that inherent value is not your NIL deal. Okay. It's not your revenue sharing, which, by the way, is revenue sharing, not profit sharing. That's where people screw this stuff up. But
Yep.
that's not the inherent value. The inherent value is figuring out who you are, what you want to be, how you move through the world. We're embodied beings, man. We're not consciousness. We're not floating consciousness. Like, we know the world through our bodies. And what better way to do it than through athletics, And so that's why I dig this stuff.
Yeah, it's really remarkable, and it's so important. As I work with coaches now, and especially younger coaches, they all want to ask me about the sets and the this and the that, but I always throw in there now the part about, okay, what are you doing to unclutter their mind at competition?
Yeah.
What are you doing to make them feel as relaxed and not comfortable, but relaxed and uncluttered? What are you doing so that things just slow down for them and they're able to really, execute what they're doing? And I say, if you're not spending an awful lot of time on that, don't worry about the sets. Don't worry about the intervals. Don't worry about their pulse, what the pulse has to be on this set, or the set sucks. There's a time and a place for that, but it's not the most important thing on race day.
Never is. Never is. And the word that keeps coming in my mind is space. Like, I given these kids, it's hard to be a young person these days. It's really,
Oh
really
God.
hard. It's really hard. And so no one comes to the pool and says, I can't wait to suck today. Like, I'm gonna be the most mediocre swimmer in the world. I'm gonna make sure I give up halfway through this practice. No one says that. Okay. So when you look out on the water and you see somebody struggling, or somebody who just can't concentrate, right? Or somebody who's just checked out, well, maybe they checked out for a reason, you know? And maybe actually, and I've changed my tune on this, maybe just getting through the practice that day is enough, is enough. Like, that's a victory in and of itself. If it's every day, then we have to sit down and have a talk. But maybe that's all they could give that day. And rather than being critical where you push them over the edge, give them the space to work through, because that's where real growth happens.
Absolutely.
It is tricky. Back to the replicating this thing is tricky. I hope so. I want to. And what I do know is that I would be very apprehensive for a club coach to do this kind of methodology. First of all, I mean, there's safe sport issues with that. There just is, like, that it's not like it
100%.
was in the 90s, man. That verbal communication, that written communication, that falls in the wrong hands. You can manipulate a young person pretty quickly and pretty easily. And in fact, when you look at the journals and you read about coaches, there's some damage that's been done that we inherit, when they get here. So what can be replicated with everybody is paying attention, paying attention, getting to know these kids as individuals, asking questions. Before COVID, I used to love the high five, like just having some kind of contact where you could tell so much by body language, man. And
Dr. So's a big high five guy.
I love a good high five, man. But that's what I
See, I don't
mean.
touch people. That's my problem. Like, you get a fist bump from me. Mark it on a
Yeah.
calendar.
Well, but also going off script is a big deal. Like, yeah, you wrote the best practice in the world and you can't wait to get this practice done. But if you have a teaching moment, throw the damn practice out the window and use that moment to teach. Like, especially in this day and age, where no matter what side of the aisle you sit on, like there's a lot of heavy stuff going on, and using moments that still, you don't have to be political to talk about being nice to people, and being nice to each other and accepting people. Like, that's not political. All right. And so these are moments that sport allows us to do this. And specifically when you come to college, I mean, think of all the unique personalities that you're coming in contact with. That's the beauty of this stuff. I was just at my friend's Hall of Fame induction, and he was a senior in high school when I was a freshman. And 30 years later, we're still best friends. Sport does that.
Yes.
Freshmen and seniors, that doesn't happen if it's not for sport, if it's not for the shared experience of swimming, which is why, that's one of my favorite people in the entire universe. When we get together, we talk about just about everything other than swimming. And then we'll talk about
Get bummed
swimming.
out when I'm like, do we have to talk swimming now? All right.
But that's the beauty of this stuff, to go from being coached to being contemporaries to being best friends. That's the beauty of what this sport has offered to us, which is why we need to take it seriously. It's not 59.9, which we love 59.9. It's so much faster than double O. But in the
Mhm.
grand scheme of things, you're not going to remember that. You're going to remember the van rides. You're going to remember the camaraderie. You're going to remember bagels on Saturday morning. You can remember banana pancakes after your first 10,000 for time. Thanks, Flack, for that. That was good stuff. That
Okay,
like
so
that.
you're one of those guys.
Well, I'm one of those guys. We did
No, I'm
10,000
talking
for
about
11.
Dan. Okay.
Was in an earlier life. Absolutely. Yes, I was.
You and Dorincott, man. Oh,
That's
whoa.
a whole different episode of this
Yes, it is.
podcast. The
Like,
evolution of
Flack, you and I
Flack
got to talk.
The
from
evolution of Flack. Now
yeah,
that's
it's
now
I
that's a
have that
that's a 12-part novel right there.
I have that album. It's a good album, man. Let me tell you. Oh, jeez. All right, guys.
All right. Well,
Anything else for the good of the order?
this has been great. One last thing before we hit the road. This is something that we're introducing a new twist on the pod. And when we have a guest on, yeah, you are
Yeah.
You're the guinea pig.
Maiden voyage
are-
right here.
you are the guinea pig. We all feel like we're pretty fortunate in what we have in our lives, etc. And no shock to anybody. What a word I really dig is grateful. So good Dr. Sowa, how about you lay 3 things on us that you are grateful for?
I'm grateful for my family, obviously. I think that's the first and foremost. It takes a village. When I talk to my team at the end of the year, I make sure to talk about my wife, because you can't do this stuff in a vacuum. You can't do it alone, and with the family, I would say my dear friends, you don't have to have 20, 30, 40. You get 5 good friends that you can rely on. That's a big deal. And that's huge. Somebody that you can call at any time, knowing that they'll pick up if you need them. That's a big deal. And I love that. Grateful for music. It's the soundtrack of our lives.
Yeah.
I always tell people, sport, music, and art. These are 3 universals, right, that tie cultures together. Every culture has them. You don't need them to live, but it sure makes life worth living. All right. I'm grateful for the greatest dog in the world, Mookie, standard poodle. He's awesome. Big afro. He's great. And I'm grateful for forums like this where we can talk and learn from each other and have conversations and foster healthy relationships. The world needs more conversations. The world needs people to listen and people be intellectually curious. So last thing I would say is that. All right. So thanks, guys. I appreciate being
pleasure.
on.
That's good stuff. Hey, let everybody know where they can find you if they want to do a follow-up.
Yes.
Yeah, well, find me in Moscow, Idaho. No, yeah, I'm a head coach at the University of Idaho. My email address is on the website. That's the best way to get in touch with me. So that'd just be first letter of my name, MSOWA at uidaho.edu. Definitely drop me an email. I love talking about this stuff. If I could be of help,
Yep.
reach out.
Well, Mark, I'm definitely going to reach out to you because obviously I'm sure Dan has told you I'm starting with a new program. I've got some ideas. I'd love and just taking a look at what you've done, and I did a quick Google search here on my computer under dissertation online, so that is available. I
Oh,
encourage
so you're
everybody
the
to take
one,
a.
huh?
I'm the guy.
Yeah. Okay.
Like when I bought Sprint Salo years ago, Salo told me, he goes, "Oh, you're the guy who bought the book." I went, "Oh,
Yeah.
thanks."
Right.
But no, I encourage everybody download it, take a look at it, reach out to Dr. Sowa. Great information out there. I think understanding our sport, not just from the X's and O's, the sets, test sets, whatever, damn 10,000s. Flack, we're gonna talk. All right. But
Go
those
recover.
but understanding the nuts and bolts and the mental aspect of our sport is incredibly important. And one of the things that I love that you said there, and I can tell you are Gen X, you're one of my people.
Amen.
You brought up music, and we came from an amazing era of music.
Okay.
Unfortunately, a lot of those voices are no longer with us, but yeah, I'm doing a lot of driving now, so there's a lot of Pearl Jam, a lot of Soundgarden, a lot of Alice in Chains being played on the road and
All
things like
right.
that.
Here's an idea for one of your next episodes. All right. Best tunes for certain practices, stuff like that. Walkout music, hype music,
My
Yeah.
favorite.
If you're not playing, go ahead,
Go
Dan.
ahead. One of my
If
favorite
you're not
questions
playing
to ask.
Alice in Chains,
One of my favorite questions to ask a swimmer is, okay, your top seed, biggest meet of your life. What tune are you coming out to?
That's a great question.
And sometimes they're like, it's like, boom, they know it. And sometimes like, huh, I'm not sure. And if they're not sure, I'm like, well, you got to figure that out.
Soul Man, Sam and Dave. There it
There you
is.
go.
That's what I'm walking
uh,
out to.
two, Enter Sandman, Metallica, and then the other one, Wood, Alice in Chains. I'm coming out to either one of those.
Go with Wood. Mariano.
Yeah,
Mariano did Enter Sandman. He kind of owns the copyright on that
I
one.
know, I know. Wood is. I was a big Chris Cornell and Lane Staley fan. Unfortunately, neither are with us anymore. But yeah, I think that understanding we talk about it, understanding the mental aspect of swimming is becoming more and more imperative for young coaches. Again, it's less about the X's and O's. It's less about those test sets. It's more about the personal relationships that you're developing. I've been to 2 weddings this summer. I had dinner with 3 different athletes in my drives to Chicago, and these are all former or alums of our program. So it's building those relationships and having those now friendships. I mean, yeah, I was the dictator on the deck, but now I consider these individuals friends. So that is all for this week's episode. They're kicking us out of the warm down pool. So for Dan Flack, Dr. Mark Sowa, this is Eric Skelly. See you next time on the warm down pool.
Go Vandals.
Go Vandals. Peace out, people.